A lonely stretch of Wyoming highway. March 25, 1988. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red. A young woman drives alone in a black Honda CRX with a vanity plate that reads LIL MISS. She's 18 years old. She has her whole life ahead of her. She's driving to see her boyfriend, planning their future, dreaming of the life they'll build together. She never arrives. And for the next 14 years, nobody knows why. What happened on that desolate highway? What evil waited in the growing darkness? And how did the search for one missing girl eventually expose one of the most terrifying killers in Wyoming history? This is the story of Lisa Marie Kimmell. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end, you'll understand why her name became a symbol of justice that refused to die. But here's what I need from you right now. If you believe that every victim deserves to have their story told, if you believe that the truth matters no matter how long it takes to find it, then do something for me. Hit that subscribe button. Share this video. Because Lisa's story is one that the world needs to hear, and you might be the person who shares it with someone who needs it most. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Lisa Marie Kimmell was born on January 15, 1969, in Billings, Montana. From her first breath, she was a fighter. Her parents, Ronald and Sheila Kimmell, knew immediately that their daughter was something special. She had this spark about her, this infectious energy that drew people in and made them feel like they mattered. Growing up in Montana, Lisa developed a love for the outdoors that would define her character. She wasn't the kind of girl who sat inside watching television while the sun was shining. No, Lisa was outside, exploring, adventuring, living life with both arms wide open. Her friends would later describe her as fearless, the kind of person who would try anything once and probably twice just to make sure she got it right. She had this laugh. Everyone who knew her remembered her laugh. It was the kind of sound that made you smile even if you didn't know what was so funny. It was genuine and pure, and it came from somewhere deep inside her soul. Lisa was beloved by everyone who knew her. She was the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over arguments and brought people together. Her siblings adored her, and her parents saw in her a future full of limitless possibility. In school, Lisa wasn't just smart. She was determined. She worked hard for everything she achieved, and she achieved quite a lot. But what set her apart wasn't her grades or her accomplishments. It was how she made people feel. Teachers remembered her decades later, not because she was the best student, but because she was kind. She noticed the kids who sat alone at lunch. She stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. After high school, Lisa threw herself into life with the same enthusiasm she'd shown as a child. She worked hard, saved money, and dreamed of bigger things. She was practical but passionate, grounded but always looking toward the horizon. And then she met him, the boyfriend, Ed Yarok. Their relationship was the kind of love story that makes you believe in destiny. They met, they clicked, and suddenly Lisa was talking about forever. Ed lived in Cody, Wyoming, and Lisa made frequent trips to see him, driving that distinctive black Honda CRX with a vanity license plate that would become famous for all the wrong reasons. That plate, LIL MISS. It was so perfectly Lisa. A little bit playful, a little bit confident, completely unforgettable. She loved that car, loved the freedom it represented, loved the way it carried her between her life and her future with Ed. In March of 1988, Lisa had been visiting friends in Denver, Colorado. She was 18 years old, full of life, and eager to get back to Wyoming to see Ed. They had plans. They had dreams. They had a future that seemed bright and certain. On March 25th, she left Denver and headed north toward Wyoming. It was a long drive, but Lisa didn't mind. She had her music, her thoughts, and the open road. The last confirmed sighting of Lisa was at a convenience store in Denver before she left. She was in high spirits, talking about seeing Ed, about the future she was building. The clerk would later remember her smile, how it lit up the whole store. Lisa got back in her Honda and pulled onto the highway. Somewhere along the route, heading north through Wyoming, Lisa Marie Kimmell vanished. Her family expected her to arrive that night. When she didn't show up, they assumed she'd decided to stop somewhere and drive through the next morning instead. But morning came, and there was no Lisa. Afternoon arrived, and the phone stayed silent. By evening, everyone knew something was wrong. This wasn't like Lisa. She always called. She always let people know where she was. The responsible, caring young woman who checked in regularly had gone completely silent. The family started making calls. They called Ed, who said Lisa hadn't arrived. They called her friends, her co-workers, anyone who might have heard from her. Nothing. It was as if Lisa had driven into that Wyoming sunset and simply ceased to exist. On April 2nd, 1988, 8 days after Lisa was last seen, a fisherman made a discovery that would shatter any remaining hope. He was fishing in the government bridge area of the North Platte River, about 8 miles southwest of Casper, Wyoming. The water was cold and dark, carrying the last of the winter runoff. As he worked his way along the bank, he spotted something that didn't belong. A body, partially submerged in the river. He called the police immediately, his hands shaking as he dialed. When investigators arrived, they recovered the body from the water and began the grim process of identification. It was Lisa Marie Kimmell. She had been murdered. The condition of her body told investigators that she had been dead for several days, which meant she had likely been killed shortly after her disappearance. An autopsy would later reveal horrifying details about her final hours. Lisa had been beaten. She had been sexually assaulted. And she had been stabbed multiple times. But the autopsy also revealed something that made investigators' blood run cold. Evidence suggested that Lisa had been held captive for some period of time before her death. This wasn't a quick killing on the side of the road. Someone had taken her, kept her, brutalized her, and then murdered her in cold blood. The case was now a homicide investigation, and the entire state of Wyoming was about to become obsessed with finding the monster who had killed Lisa Marie Kimmell. But here's the thing about monsters. They don't always look like what you'd expect. Sometimes they walk among us, smiling, working, living their lives as if they're just like everyone else. And sometimes, it takes years to find them. The investigation into Lisa Kimmell's murder began immediately, and from the very start, investigators knew they were dealing with something different. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was calculated, deliberate, and utterly chilling. The first major clue was what they didn't find. Lisa's car, that distinctive black Honda CRX with the LIL MISS vanity plate, was missing. A murderer who takes the time to dispose of a victim's vehicle is a murderer who's trying to cover their tracks. This wasn't someone acting in a moment of passion. This was someone who had thought about what they were doing. Investigators fanned out across Wyoming, searching for the car. They put out bulletins, talked to gas station attendants, interviewed truckers who regularly drove the highway. Everyone was looking for LIL MISS. Meanwhile, the autopsy results painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Lisa's final days. The evidence suggested she had been held alive for approximately 1 to 6 days before her death. Days of terror that no one should ever have to experience. Days during which Lisa suffered unimaginable horrors at the hands of her captor. Lisa's family was devastated but determined. Ronald and Sheila Kimmell became fixtures at the Natrona County Sheriff's Office, pushing for updates, demanding action, refusing to let their daughter become just another unsolved case file. They established a reward fund, appeared on television, and pleaded with the public for information. Someone knows something, Sheila would say in interview after interview. Someone saw something. Please, help us find the person who did this to our daughter. The community responded. Tips poured in from across Wyoming and neighboring states. People reported seeing the black Honda, seeing Lisa at various stops along the highway, seeing suspicious characters who might have been the killer. Investigators followed up on every lead, no matter how small. But here's where the case took its first frustrating turn. Every lead went cold. Every tip turned into a dead end. The killer, whoever they were, had been careful. Too careful. Shortly after Lisa's body was discovered, investigators got a significant break. Lisa's black Honda CRX was found in Casper, Wyoming. The car had been discovered in a parking lot, partially hidden, sitting there for days since the murder. The car had been found, but it raised more questions than it answered. Inside, investigators found signs of what had happened. There was evidence of violence, evidence that someone had been in that car who shouldn't have been. Most significantly, investigators found biological evidence that could potentially identify the killer. Forensic teams went over every inch of that Honda. They lifted fingerprints, collected hair samples, and documented everything they found. In 1988, DNA technology was still in its infancy, but investigators preserved samples anyway, hoping that future advances might crack the case. This decision to preserve biological evidence would prove to be one of the most important decisions in the entire investigation. The investigators in 1988 couldn't have known it, but they were setting the stage for justice 14 years in the future. Here's something I want you to think about. Imagine being Lisa's parents, knowing your daughter's car had been found, knowing evidence was being collected, believing that an arrest was imminent. Imagine the hope they must have felt, followed by the crushing disappointment as days turned to weeks and no arrest came. What would you do if justice for your loved one kept slipping further and further away? Would you give up, or would you keep fighting? Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Because the Kimmell family made a choice that would define the next 14 years of their lives. They chose to fight. The investigation continued, but progress was agonizingly slow. Investigators developed a profile of the likely killer. They believed he was familiar with the area, knew the back roads and the river where Lisa's body was dumped. They believed he was organized, methodical, and potentially had committed similar crimes before or would again. But a profile isn't an arrest. And without a specific suspect, the case began to stall. The Kimmell family refused to accept this. They hired private investigators, conducted their own research, and kept Lisa's case in the public eye through media appearances and community events. They became tireless advocates for their daughter, refusing to let her memory fade. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the man who killed their daughter was living in plain sight, not far from where Lisa's body was found. His name was Dale Wayne Eaton, and he was a predator hiding behind an ordinary facade. But in 1988, Dale Eaton wasn't on anyone's radar. He was just another face in the crowd, another man living his life in rural Wyoming. He worked odd jobs, kept to himself, and gave no outward indication of the darkness that lurked within him. Eaton had a property outside Moneta, Wyoming, a remote piece of land that provided the isolation and privacy that someone with his secrets would need. But for now, investigators had no reason to look his way. He wasn't connected to Lisa, had no apparent link to the case, and had done nothing to attract law enforcement attention. The case went cold. Not officially, of course. Officially, the investigation remained open and active. But leads dried up, witnesses' memories faded, and other cases demanded attention. Lisa's file was moved to a shelf, not forgotten, but no longer the top priority. For the Kimmell family, this was unacceptable. They continued their private efforts, spending their own money, sacrificing their own peace, all in pursuit of justice for Lisa. Sheila Kimmell became an expert on her daughter's case. She knew every detail, every piece of evidence, every theory that had been proposed and discarded. She corresponded with investigators regularly, always polite but always persistent, reminding them that Lisa deserved answers. The years passed. 1989, 1990, 1991. Each year without an arrest was another year of pain for the family, another year of the killer walking free, living his life while Lisa lay in her grave. But throughout it all, the Kimmell family never lost hope. They believed, with the kind of faith that moves mountains, that someday the truth would come out. Someday, someone would slip up, some piece of evidence would emerge, and justice would finally be served. They were right. But the road to justice would be longer and stranger than anyone could have predicted. In the early 1990s, something remarkable was happening in crime laboratories around the world. Scientists were developing new techniques for analyzing DNA evidence, techniques that could identify individuals with unprecedented accuracy. What had once seemed like science fiction was becoming reality. Investigators who had worked Lisa's case from the beginning started to wonder. They had preserved biological evidence from the crime scene and from Lisa's car. Could these new techniques finally crack the case? The samples were sent for analysis. And for the first time in years, there was genuine hope that Lisa's killer might finally be identified. But DNA technology in the early 1990s was still limited. The samples from Lisa's case yielded results, but without a suspect to compare them to. The DNA profile was just a string of genetic markers waiting for a match. It was progress, but it wasn't closure. The family kept waiting. The years kept passing. And somewhere in Wyoming, Dale Wayne Eaton continued his life, secure in the belief that he had gotten away with murder. He was wrong. To understand how Lisa's killer was finally caught, you need to understand who he was. And the truth is, Dale Wayne Eaton was a walking nightmare that no one recognized as dangerous until it was far too late. Born on September 10, 1945, Eaton grew up in a troubled environment. His early life was marked by instability and dysfunction, the kind of circumstances that often produce troubled adults. But plenty of people survive difficult beginnings without becoming killers. What made Dale Eaton different? That's a question that psychologists and investigators would debate for years. What we know for certain is that by adulthood, Eaton had developed a pattern of concerning behavior that would escalate over time. He drifted through life, never establishing roots, never forming lasting relationships, never building the kind of stable existence that most people take for granted. He worked as a mechanic, did odd jobs, and moved around, never staying in one place long enough to attract sustained attention. By the 1970s, Eaton had made his way to Wyoming, drawn perhaps by the isolation and the wide open spaces. He acquired property near Moneta, a remote location in the high desert of central Wyoming. The property was isolated, far from prying eyes, perfect for someone who valued privacy above all else. Eaton's property would later become central to the investigation. It was the kind of place where terrible things could happen without anyone knowing. Miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by empty land, it was a predator's paradise. Throughout the 1980s, Eaton lived his double life. To the few people who encountered him, he was odd but seemed harmless, a loner who kept to himself and didn't cause obvious trouble. They had no idea what lurked behind his unremarkable exterior. Eaton had some run-ins with the law over the years, but nothing that would have connected him to violent crime. He was careful, methodical, and patient. He knew how to avoid attracting the kind of attention that would bring investigators to his door. The night Lisa disappeared, Eaton was prowling. He spotted the black Honda CRX with the young woman behind the wheel, and something triggered in his predatory brain. This was his target. The details of exactly how he intercepted Lisa remained somewhat unclear. Perhaps he flagged her down, pretending to need help. Perhaps he staged some kind of emergency. Perhaps he simply forced her off the road. What we know for certain is that by some means, he got her to stop. And once she stopped, Lisa's fate was sealed. Eaton took her to his remote property near Moneta. For an agonizing period of time, possibly days, he held her captive. What happened during those hours is documented in court records, but too horrific to describe in detail. The evidence speaks to unimaginable suffering, to a young woman held by a monster who showed no mercy. When Eaton was finished with his crimes, he murdered Lisa. He then transported her body to the North Platte River and disposed of her in the cold water, hoping the river would carry away any evidence of his crimes. He drove her Honda to Casper, where he abandoned it in a parking lot. He may have attempted to clean the vehicle, but he couldn't remove all the traces of what had happened. Microscopic evidence remained, waiting to betray him. Then he went back to his life. He continued his existence as if nothing had happened. He ate his meals, slept in his bed, and moved through the community as if he were just another citizen. For 14 years, he appeared to have gotten away with it. 14 years of freedom while Lisa's family suffered. 14 years of living without consequences. 14 years of justice delayed. But justice delayed is not justice denied. And the wheels of justice were about to start turning again. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic DNA technology had advanced dramatically from its early days. New techniques could analyze biological samples with unprecedented precision. Crime laboratories across the country were revisiting cold cases, applying new science to old evidence. Lisa's case was among those selected for renewed analysis. The biological evidence that had been so carefully preserved in 1988 was subjected to modern DNA profiling techniques. And this time, the results were much more useful. Investigators obtained a clear DNA profile from the evidence. They had the genetic fingerprint of Lisa's killer. Now they just needed to find a match. In the late 1990s, a crucial development occurred. Dale Wayne Eaton was convicted of a federal crime and was required to submit a DNA sample as part of his sentence. This sample was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders. Eaton probably thought nothing of it at the time. He had gotten away with Lisa's murder for nearly a decade. Why would a DNA sample matter now? He was about to find out. When Lisa's case evidence was run through CODIS in 2002, the system found what investigators had been hoping for: a match, a cold hit. After 14 years of waiting, the database had identified the man who murdered Lisa Marie Kimmell. The name that came back was Dale Wayne Eaton. When investigators received the match notification, they could barely believe it. After all these years, after all the dead ends and false leads, they finally had their man. The DNA match was definitive, the statistical probability so overwhelming that there was no reasonable doubt about the identification. The Natrona County Sheriff's Office and the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation began building their case. They needed to move carefully, to gather additional evidence, to ensure that Eaton would not escape justice through any legal technicality. They started by learning everything they could about their suspect. They pulled his records, traced his movements in 1988, and mapped out his connection to the area where Lisa disappeared and where her body was found. What they discovered confirmed their worst suspicions. Dale Wayne Eaton had been living near Monetta, Wyoming in March 1988. His property was within easy access of the route Lisa would have traveled. The geography of the crime matched perfectly with Eaton's known location. And the DNA didn't lie. The net was closing around Dale Wayne Eaton. After 14 years of freedom, his time was finally running out. The DNA match was powerful evidence, but investigators knew they needed to build the strongest possible case. They gathered everything they could find connecting Eaton to the crime, documenting his location in 1988, his access to the area, and the irrefutable DNA evidence linking him to the assault on Lisa. On March 15, 2002, almost exactly 14 years after Lisa's disappearance, law enforcement officers arrested Dale Wayne Eaton. He was 56 years old, weathered by years of hard living, a man who looked unremarkable rather than monstrous. But appearances, as we know, can be deceiving. Eaton was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated sexual assault in the death of Lisa Marie Kimmell. For the first time in 14 years, the man responsible for Lisa's death was behind bars. For the Kimmell family, the news of the arrest was overwhelming. After 14 years of fighting, hoping, and refusing to give up, they finally had answers. They finally knew who had taken their daughter from them. Sheila Kimmell spoke publicly after the arrest, her voice carrying the weight of 14 years of pain and determination. "We never stopped believing this day would come," she said. "We never stopped fighting for Lisa. She deserved justice, and now she's going to get it." But the legal process was just beginning. Eaton was held without bail, deemed too dangerous to be released pending trial. Prosecutors from Natrona County began assembling their case, organizing evidence, preparing witnesses, and building the narrative that would convince a jury of Eaton's guilt. The DNA evidence was their cornerstone. The biological material recovered from Lisa's car and from the crime matched Eaton's genetic profile with overwhelming certainty. This wasn't speculation or circumstantial evidence. This was science, precise and irrefutable. But prosecutors wanted to present a complete picture. They wanted the jury to understand not just that Eaton had committed this crime, but who Lisa had been and what had been taken from the world when she died. They gathered statements from Lisa's family and friends, painting a portrait of a vibrant young woman whose life had been cut short. They documented the investigation, showing the jury how 14 years of persistence had finally led to justice. Investigators also looked into whether Eaton might be connected to other crimes. His property, his lifestyle, and his profile raised questions about whether Lisa was his only victim. While no additional charges were filed in connection with other specific cases, the investigation raised troubling possibilities that suggested a pattern of predatory behavior. The defense faced an almost impossible task. The DNA evidence was overwhelming, and Eaton's defense attorneys knew that attacking the science directly would be futile. Instead, they prepared to argue procedural issues and to challenge the death penalty that prosecutors were seeking. As the trial date approached, the attention of Wyoming focused on Casper. This was the biggest case in years, a 14-year-old murder finally coming to trial. The community that had been haunted by Lisa's unsolved death was about to see justice served. The Kimmell family prepared to face their daughter's killer in court. It would be painful beyond words, but they were ready. They had waited 14 years for this moment. They would not look away now. The trial of Dale Wayne Eaton began in March 2004, in Casper, Wyoming. The timing was significant, coming almost exactly 16 years after Lisa's murder. The town that had discovered her body and her abandoned car would now witness the trial of her killer. The prosecution was ready. They had built a meticulous case, organizing evidence and testimony to tell the story of Lisa's murder and the long road to justice. The defense strategy became clear early in the proceedings. Eaton's attorneys could not credibly deny that their client had encountered Lisa. The DNA evidence made that impossible. Instead, they attempted to raise questions about the investigation, about the handling of evidence, about anything that might create doubt in the minds of jurors. It was a losing battle, but defense attorneys are obligated to mount the best defense possible for their clients, regardless of the evidence against them. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They walked the jury through Lisa's final journey, from her departure from Denver to her discovery in the North Platte River. They presented the physical evidence, explained the DNA match, and demonstrated how the science had finally caught up with the killer. Expert witnesses testified about DNA analysis, explaining to the jury how the genetic evidence conclusively identified Eaton as the perpetrator. The statistics were overwhelming. The odds of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Eaton were infinitesimally small. The emotional heart of the trial came from Lisa's family. Sheila Kimmell testified about her daughter, about the person Lisa had been, about the dreams that were never fulfilled. She spoke of the 14 years of waiting, the determination that had kept the family fighting when hope seemed lost. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Other witnesses painted a picture of Lisa's final days, her excitement about seeing Ed, her plans for the future. The jury saw photographs of the smiling young woman, heard stories about her kindness and her spirit. They understood that this was not just a case about evidence and procedure. This was about a real person whose life had been stolen. The prosecution also presented evidence about Eaton himself, his history, his connection to the area, his opportunity to commit the crime. They showed how all the pieces fit together, how the evidence pointed unmistakably to one man. When the defense's turn came, they could offer little to counter the prosecution's case. Eaton did not take the stand in his own defense, a decision that avoided cross-examination but also prevented him from offering any alternative explanation. His attorneys did their best to raise procedural issues, but the evidence was simply too strong. After hearing all the evidence, the jury retired to deliberate. The wait was agonizing for the Kimmell family, who had already waited 14 years for this moment. The deliberation did not take long. The jury returned with their verdict. Guilty, on all counts. Dale Wayne Eaton was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault in the death of Lisa Marie Kimmell. The courtroom erupted in emotion. The Kimmell family wept, overwhelmed by relief and grief intertwined so tightly they were impossible to separate. 16 years after Lisa's death, her killer had finally been held accountable. But the trial was not over. In Wyoming, first-degree murder carried the possibility of the death penalty, and prosecutors had announced their intention to seek the ultimate punishment. The sentencing phase began immediately, and it was in many ways even more intense than the trial itself. The prosecution presented additional evidence about the nature of Eaton's crimes, the suffering Lisa had endured, the impact on her family and community. Victim impact statements were read into the record. Lisa's parents, her siblings, her friends all spoke about what they had lost, about the void that Lisa's death had left in their lives. The jury heard about 14 years of holidays without Lisa, milestones she never reached, the grandchildren Sheila and Ronald would never have from their daughter. The defense presented mitigating factors, attempting to humanize Eaton, to present circumstances that might persuade the jury to spare his life. They spoke of his difficult upbringing, possible mental health issues, and other factors that might have contributed to his crimes. The jury listened to both sides, and then retired to deliberate on the question of life or death. Again, the deliberation was not long. The jury returned with their recommendation: death. Dale Wayne Eaton was sentenced to die for the murder of Lisa Marie Kimmell. For the Kimmell family, the death sentence represented the full measure of justice. The man who had taken their daughter had been convicted and would pay the ultimate price. The years of fighting had not been in vain. Sheila Kimmell spoke outside the courthouse after the sentencing. "This is for Lisa," she said. "This is what she deserved. We never stopped fighting, and we never will stop fighting for victims everywhere." But even the death sentence was not the end of the story. In our legal system, death sentences trigger automatic appeals, a lengthy process designed to ensure that the ultimate punishment is applied correctly. Dale Wayne Eaton's case was far from over. After the trial, Dale Wayne Eaton was transferred to death row in Wyoming State Prison. He joined the small number of inmates awaiting execution in a state that rarely imposed the death penalty. His attorneys immediately began the appeals process, challenging various aspects of the trial and sentencing. This is standard procedure in death penalty cases, designed to ensure that no person is executed due to legal error. The Kimmell family understood that appeals would take years. They had already waited 14 years for a trial. They could wait more for the sentence to be carried out. In the meantime, they continued their advocacy work. Sheila Kimmell became a powerful voice for victims' rights, using her experience to help other families navigate the painful journey she knew all too well. She testified before legislative bodies, spoke at conferences, and worked to improve the system that had ultimately delivered justice for Lisa. The Kimmells established ongoing efforts to support victims of violent crime, to ensure that other families would not feel as alone as they had in the early years after Lisa's death. Their tragedy became a platform for helping others, a way of giving meaning to their loss. Meanwhile, investigators continued to examine whether Eaton might be connected to other unsolved cases. His profile, his property, and his behavior raised questions about whether there were other victims. Several unsolved disappearances in Wyoming during the 1980s shared characteristics that made investigators wonder. However, it's important to be clear about what was proven. While Eaton was investigated in connection with other cases, he was only ever charged and convicted in Lisa Kimmell's murder. Speculation about other victims remained just that, speculation. No additional charges were ever filed. The appeals process dragged on for years. Eaton's attorneys challenged the DNA evidence, the trial procedures, the sentencing, everything they could think of that might save their client's life. In 2014, 10 years after his conviction, Eaton's death sentence was overturned. The Wyoming Supreme Court found issues with the way the jury had been instructed during the penalty phase of his trial. The death sentence was vacated. For the Kimmell family, this news was devastating. After all they had been through, after finally seeing Lisa's killer sentenced to death, it seemed like justice was slipping away again. But the conviction itself stood. Eaton remained guilty of first-degree murder. The question was only what his punishment would be. Prosecutors had to decide whether to seek a new penalty phase trial, with a new jury deciding between life and death, or to accept a sentence of life in prison without parole. Given the passage of time, the emotional toll on the family, and the uncertainty of another trial, a resolution was reached. Dale Wayne Eaton was re-sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never walk free again. He would die in prison. The only question was whether that death would come by execution or by natural causes. For some, the commutation of the death sentence felt like an injustice. Eaton had taken Lisa's life with unimaginable cruelty. Shouldn't he face the same fate? But others saw it differently. Eaton would spend every remaining day of his life behind bars, stripped of freedom, stripped of everything that makes life worth living. He would die alone, in a cell, without the liberty he had stolen from Lisa. In that sense, justice was served. The Kimmell family made peace with the outcome. They had fought for 26 years, from Lisa's disappearance in 1988 to the final resolution of the appeals in 2014. They had seen their daughter's killer convicted and imprisoned forever. They had achieved what they set out to achieve. Lisa's killer would never hurt anyone again. That was what mattered most. The years after the final resolution of Eaton's case brought both healing and continued purpose for the Kimmell family. They had achieved justice for Lisa, but the absence of their daughter remained a constant presence in their lives. But grief is not the only emotion that survives loss. There is also love, persistent and undiminished. The Kimmells kept Lisa's memory alive, not through mourning alone, but through action. Sheila Kimmell continued her advocacy work, helping other families navigate the nightmare of losing a loved one to violence. She shared her story, her lessons learned, and her hard-won wisdom with anyone who needed it. The Kimmell family's fight had lasting effects beyond their own case. It demonstrated the importance of preserving biological evidence, even when current technology couldn't fully analyze it. The investigators in 1988 who carefully collected and stored DNA evidence had made justice possible 14 years later. This lesson influenced law enforcement practices across the country. Cold case units began reviewing old evidence with new eyes, applying advanced DNA techniques to samples that had been waiting for years. Victims who might never have received justice were identified, and their killers brought to account, all because the Kimmell case showed what was possible. Lisa's case became a teaching example in forensic science courses, a demonstration of how patience and scientific advancement could solve seemingly impossible cases. Students learned about the importance of evidence preservation, chain of custody, and the constantly evolving capabilities of forensic analysis. The case also highlighted the crucial role that victims' families play in keeping cases alive. The Kimmell family's persistence, their refusal to let Lisa become just another unsolved case, kept pressure on investigators and kept the case in the public eye. When the DNA match came through in 2002, there were still people actively working the case because the family never let them forget. Dale Wayne Eaton remained in prison as the years passed, a footnote in a story that was really about Lisa and her family. He gave no interviews, offered no explanations, showed no remorse. He simply existed in his cell, waiting for death. In January 2024, Dale Wayne Eaton died in prison at the age of 78. He never walked free again after his 2002 arrest. He never expressed remorse for what he did to Lisa. He died as he lived, a monster who refused to acknowledge his own evil. His death brought a final measure of closure. The man who had haunted the Kimmell family for 36 years was gone. Lisa's killer had paid for his crimes with every remaining day of his miserable life. The Kimmell family had outlasted him. Their love for Lisa had proven stronger than his hatred, their determination more powerful than his evil. They had won. I started this story by asking you to picture a lonely highway at sunset, a young woman driving alone, her whole life ahead of her. Now I want you to picture something different. Picture a family that never gave up. Picture investigators who preserved evidence because they believed that someday, somehow, science would catch up. Picture a justice system that, despite its flaws and delays, ultimately held the killer accountable. Picture Lisa Marie Kimmell, not as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. Her death was a tragedy, one of the countless tragedies that occur when evil crosses paths with innocence. But what came after was something more. It was a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up, the belief that justice, though delayed, will eventually arrive. The Kimmell family's fight changed how we approach cold cases. Their determination inspired improvements in evidence preservation and victim advocacy. Lisa's death mattered, not because of what was taken, but because of what was given in response. Dale Wayne Eaton thought he had gotten away with murder. For 14 years, he walked free, confident that his crimes would never catch up with him. But he underestimated the power of a family's love, the persistence of investigators, and the relentless advance of science. In the end, he died alone in a prison cell, stripped of everything, his name forever linked to evil. That is justice, even if it came slowly. That is accountability, even if it was delayed. And Lisa? Lisa is remembered as she should be. Not as a victim, but as a daughter, a sister, a girlfriend, a young woman with dreams and plans and a future that was stolen from her. The people who loved her ensured that she would never be forgotten, that her story would be told, that her name would be associated with hope rather than despair. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, you understand something important. You understand that evil exists in this world, that predators walk among us, that terrible things happen to good people. But you also understand that love is stronger than hate, that persistence can overcome any obstacle, and that justice, though it may take years, will ultimately prevail. Lisa's story is a tragedy, but it's also a triumph. The triumph of a family that refused to give up. The triumph of investigators who preserved evidence against the day it could be used. The triumph of science that caught a killer when nothing else could. And ultimately, it's the triumph of memory over forgetting, of love over loss, of light over darkness. Lisa Marie Kimmell was 18 years old when she died. She never got to marry Ed, never got to have children, never got to grow old surrounded by the people who loved her. Those dreams died with her in Wyoming in 1988. But her name lives on. Her story inspires others. Her legacy endures. And Dale Wayne Eaton? He's a footnote now, a cautionary tale about what happens when evil thinks it can escape consequences. He's remembered only as the obstacle that was overcome, the monster that was finally slain. Lisa wins. Her family wins. Justice wins. That's the ending of this story. Not just an ending, but a victory. A reminder that no matter how dark things get, no matter how long the wait, the light eventually breaks through. Remember Lisa Marie Kimmell. Remember her smile, her spirit, her dreams. Remember her family's courage and their refusal to surrender. And the next time you see a lonely highway at sunset, think about Lisa. Think about all the people who refused to forget her. Think about the justice that finally came 36 years after she vanished. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Not when love refuses to quit. Not ever. This is for Lisa. This is for her family. This is for everyone who ever refused to give up when the world told them to stop fighting. Remember her name. Share her story. And never stop believing that justice will prevail.